Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. This is Orijit Sengupta from Beyond Core, and we're going to start the event in the next few minutes. I believe people are still connecting in, so I'm not starting too early. We're going to use the website for any questions. So essentially, on the right-hand side of your page, you should see a question and answer section. To enter a question, select all panelists from the drop-down menu and type in your question and send. We will try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. As you can imagine, it is a little difficult to see questions as you're presenting, so I'll probably have to wait till the end to answer questions. If you have any questions at this time before we start, please do feel free to send me. So as we wait for people to join in, I'll put up my profile. My name is Orijit Sengupta. I'm the CEO of Beyond Core. I'm also the chair of the IOP Cloud Computing chapter, and you're going to see several references to the IOP Cloud Computing chapter throughout our presentation. And I also co-chair the Outsourcing Tools and Technology Innovation chapter. And I'm going to describe IOP later in this presentation. I've been doing quite a bit of work around business process as a service. Along with my team, we have multiple patents in this space. Previously worked at many of the usual suspects you might have imagined. I've done some work with Stanford University and other universities. In fact, right now I have two teams of 5 Stanford students each, so a total of 10 Stanford students working on a BPaaS-related research for me. And if any of you have some interesting BPaaS stories, or if you would like to be interviewed by Stanford students, feel free to send them an email at actually send me an email at the address at the end of the presentation, and I can forward it to the students. My educational background, when I was at Stanford, I was studying too many things at the same time. So studied computer science, economics, and believe it or not, I missed my dance minor by 1 class. And any of you saw me in person can understand why that sounds so strange. And I have an MBA with distinction from the Harvard Business School. At this point, hopefully most of the people who are going to join us have joined us, so let's dive right into the presentation. So what is Beyond Core? Beyond Core is a game changer in the domain of business process operations. So let's talk about what Beyond Core is today before I go into what Beyond Core is doing for tomorrow. So today, essentially, we have a patented software as a service solution that delivers in a matter of 6 hours the quality benefits that Six Sigma delivers in 6 months. So many of you may have heard of Six Sigma or have used Six Sigma. These are manual quality improvement methodologies that are very common in industry. In fact, according to many estimates, GE by itself, General Electric by itself, spent more than $1 billion on Six Sigma. Our technology has been leveraged by 10 of the Fortune 100. In fact, it looks like in the last couple of weeks, we have gotten 3 other customers, so pretty soon it'll get to 13 of the Fortune 100. But 10 of the Fortune 100 have already used it, and 6 of the 10 largest outsourcing providers have used Beyond Core. If you go to our website, you'll see some of these names, but here's a quote from GMAC Commercial Mortgage. As you can imagine, doing anything at a firm like GMAC takes time, but we were able to deliver 30% quality improvement in just 1 week at GMAC Commercial Mortgage. And that's pretty difficult to pull off, excepting for the fact that our technology is designed in such a way that it can figure out patterns of errors and provide actionable information in a matter of minutes, rather than the traditional methods, which can take a long time. Tom Friedman, probably the most famous commentator when it comes to globalization and outsourcing, wrote about us in both his column in the New York Times and in The World is Flat, the release 3 of that book. As I mentioned earlier, Beyond Core also chairs the IOP Cloud Computing chapter. IOP is the International Association of Outsourcing Professionals. But one of the most intriguing things about the IOP has been that we have been able to bring together some of the most important providers as well as some of the most important customers of outsourcing in one place. So we just talked about what Beyond Core is doing today, but what I'm more interested in talking about is this domain of business process as a service, where we are doing some pretty interesting work that I would love to share with you. I'm also going to share with you several case studies that we have collected out of the IOP and that we are going to do at the end. But first, let's talk about business process as a service. What does it actually mean? Well, many companies, when we talk to them, for example, this is a quote from the CEO of a leading outsourcing firms. Many of them are looking at BPaaS, business process as a service, as a way to replace VPN. So instead of using VPN, I'm just going to go in and use software as a service. Well, that's a very limited view of what business process as a service can be. And I hope you will agree that this is not exactly a perfect definition. It's a very limited definition of what business process as a service could be. Well, a better definition, perhaps, is one which says business process as a service, just add BPO to SaaS, right? If you add business process outsourcing to software as a service, haven't we achieved exactly the same thing? So, for example, this is a quote from the CEO, from the head of cloud computing of a large software firm, where he was talking about how the company is trying to focus on taking care of the technology needs, and they rely on their service partners to take care of BPaaS. In fact, at this Cloud Core conference itself, the CloudSlam conference itself, you might have heard the speaker from Microsoft talk about how, in response to my question to him, talk about how Microsoft, if it has an engineering solution to the BPaaS problem, would be very interested in it. But today, it sees it more as a service solution. Well, it's a fair definition, but we run into certain problems with it. The problem is business process outsourcing is not fundamentally scalable. If you think about software as a service, the whole vision is the hyper-scalability of software as a service. And BPO suddenly introduces a scalability trap. How does it do that? First, if I look at the process, when I transfer a process from the client to the provider today in traditional BPO, and remember, we are talking about traditional BPO here, several firms are trying to find ways to improve these processes. But fundamentally, in traditional BPO, what you do is a lift and shift process transfer. You go in, you document the process really well, you shift it over, and you replicate it. That takes time, and it's not scalable, because fundamentally, this is manual in nature. Factory-style operational control, what do I mean by that? The way operational control is achieved in many of these BPOs is basically you put people in a large room, you put a lot of security restrictions on them, you observe them with cameras, you have managers walking the floors, you actually take statistical process control charts and put it up on the walls, and all the metrics are visible. It's done a lot like a factory. Well, the problem with factories are they are not hyper-scalable. You're not going to go in and firstly, they're lumpy as you scale because you're scaling by, I now will set up one new center in this one geography with 500 people in it. You can't really scale by, okay, I'm going to add in 5 people today and take it away tomorrow. The outsourcing customers, of course, are trying to achieve exactly that. But traditional BPO, the providers of outsourcing, can't really do that kind of rapid scalability up and down. Manual process improvement, and this becomes a key issue. So when you're using methodologies like Six Sigma and Toyota Production System and Lean, these are very manual and time-consuming methodologies. Again, that does not allow hyper-scalability. You can't scale that process to 200,000 users to 2 million users. Can you imagine a large BPO firm with 2 million workers? That would not be a very scalable solution. And, of course, ongoing process changes, because processes keep changing. And as you well know, every client that at least I have encountered, their processes keep changing over time, both because of market changes and regulatory changes, but also because of internal process changes. And that every time there's a process change, you have to go in and you have to rework the process, you have to improve the process. On the people side, there's a similar scalability gap. So, for example, the hiring of people is fundamentally manual. So you have to do a lot of interviews, you have to spend a lot of time finding the right kind of candidates, do the right kind of security checks on the people, and then you bring them on board. Well, that's not very scalable. Management through constraints, what do we mean by that? If any of you have ever visited a BPO center, what you'll find is they will look at what devices you have on your in your bag. Do you have a USB key with you? They'll make sure you don't have a camera with you. They will, in some cases, not even let you take in a notepad. Essentially, what they're trying to do is make sure you cannot steal information from the environment, for example. And they put similar, if not even stricter constraints on their own employees. But what we talk about here is management through constraints. You're making sure your people can't do certain activities through putting physical limitations on them. And that's not very scalable outside of the factory setting. Manual training, it's often the same training being given to multiple operators. It's not specific to their needs. It's not specific to what they want to do. So what do you end up having to do? You have big rooms with people giving training to large numbers of people. Again, it's not a very scalable. It's not e-learning in many cases. Though, again, this is traditional BPO. Many BPO firms are trying to move away from it through e-learning and customized training, for example. And finally, high employee churn. Because people keep moving out of these companies, you always run into the situation that you finally trained an employee and that employee was doing well, and then all of a sudden there's employee churn, that employee has left. So because of this, BPO itself introduces a scalability trap, and if we define BPaaS as just add BPO to SaaS, we're always going to run into this problem of hyperscalability. I personally believe BPaaS, for it to be really successful, has to have two characteristics that are key. First is, imagine a mother of three sitting in Detroit who wants to process invoices for just 3 hours. If BPaaS cannot provide employment to that person, then BPaaS has not achieved hyperscalability. It cannot be about employees hired by companies who sit in work environments and are full-time employees with all these constraints. If that's what BPaaS is about, it cannot achieve the kind of hyperscale that it needs to achieve to be properly a part of cloud computing. But interestingly enough, this is precisely why certain commentators of cloud computing, when I discussed with them, they basically said, we don't include BPaaS in cloud computing mainly because, hey, I don't see how it can achieve the hyperscalability. Fair point, but just turn it around. It's not a matter of should BPaaS be a part of cloud computing. It's more a matter of how do we need to think about BPaaS to make sure it can be hyperscalable. So let's look at a definition that I think it's a pretty good definition. Of course, I kind of came up with this, so I of course think it's good. There's several different definitions out in the market which are somewhat similar. Essentially what I'm saying is a BPaaS is a shift from means to outcomes. So instead of today where we manage the people, the process/software, and the systems, and we might actually have outsourced all three components to different people, from that we're shifting to outcomes, where we are concerned about did my invoice get processed. And if you processed my invoice on time and you process my invoice accurately, I will pay you 10 cents per invoice, for example. And I was talking to certain senior Gartner analysts, and they were telling me they're beginning to see more and more these kind of contracts happening in the marketplace anyway. One important aspect to this is if you think about contracts which are focused on, for example, how many people do I employ in a business process, that by definition actually creates a disincentive, if you will, to innovation. Because if you do innovation, you're going to reduce the number of people in the process, and if your payment is tied to the number of people you have deployed in a contract, well, the really good guys are going to find ways to create value for their clients anyway. But for many firms, the fact that the contract is written in terms of the number of people deployed on the process becomes a disincentive to actually doing an improvement of the process. But when you shift over to processing invoices and you're getting paid per invoice processed, especially per invoice processed accurately, now your incentives are fully aligned and people are going to find every way to make that process as efficient as possible. So if this is the definition of BPaaS, let's take a look at what are the typical constraints on BPaaS. What are the challenges? What needs to happen to make BPaaS successful? Well, the challenges actually are similar to what we have seen in the platform as a service and software as a service domain, but they are not identical. So, for example, security. In platform as a service or software as a service, you're really protecting the border. So your goal is intrusion detection, for example. Can an unauthorized person get access to my software? If they can, that's a problem. With BPaaS, though, it becomes a matter of protecting the interior. Your focus here is not on intrusion by an unauthorized user. It's on how do I make sure my workers do not steal information? How do I make sure my workers do not commit fraud? It's a fundamentally different way of looking at it. And whereas BPO is trying to solve this through constraints, through management, through traditional methods, for BPaaS to be successful, there has to be ways to do this scalably through technology, not through traditional methods. And I think that is both the challenge and the opportunity, that those of us in the software domain, people who really understand these capabilities, need to bring software and technological solutions to BPaaS to make it successful. Quality. Well, again, in PaaS and SaaS, I hope you'll agree that it's fundamentally about infrastructure quality. In fact, one of the most common quality metrics that I hear from people is uptime. But when we move over to BPaaS, it's no longer about infrastructure quality, it's about output quality. So how many invoices did you process accurately for me? How many invoices did you process on time for me? How can I get ongoing monitoring of the quality and productivity of the work that's being done? That's the focus when it comes to BPaaS side. And this is a domain where there are a lot of very interesting work that has been done on the productivity side for doing ongoing metrics of what is being processed. There's actually some work that BeyondCore has done, which led to us winning the award for the most innovative cloud computing company just a few months back. There's a lot of work that's being done here already because this is so key also to BPO, not just to BPaaS. Scalability, well, again, when you look at PaaS SaaS, you're looking at the scalability of the technology. Can the technology be used by 50,000 people? Can it be used by 5 million people? Can it be used by 50 million people? But when we move over to BPaaS, as we talked about earlier, it's about scalable processes and to some extent the scalability of the people. If you cannot solve that, you cannot solve BPaaS. Now, there are certain very interesting trends going on here. One is around process platforms. So companies are trying to find ways to serve, let's say, 7 different customers for whom they're processing invoices. Can they serve the seven customers in the same way through one process platform? It's a very intriguing approach, though certain companies are taking the approach of trying to standardize the process. I don't think that's going to succeed. For example, in my old days at Oracle, every Oracle engineer, I think, used to think in terms of, we are going to ship the best possible product and our customers are going to just use it. But the reality is almost every Oracle app was customized. Same with SAP. If after so many years Oracle and SAP has not been able to push a standardized process and a standardized application on their customer base, I don't think it will be possible to push a standardized process to the customer base in a setting either. But what you can do, a properly designed process platform can find enough of the process that is general between the various companies and run that in a consistent way and then deal with the variances differently. Again, an approach very similar to what we have seen in a software as a service, platform as a service domain as well, where you serve people in a standard way but then deal with certain variances on the side. Process transfer was one of the things I was talking about when you transition the process from the client to the provider. Again, that is currently very manual. It needs to be solved. There also has to be a shift from lift and shift transfer to iterative process transfer, where you look at the delta between the process you're trying to transfer and the process as it exists at the provider today. So you're trying to kind of drive out the difference between the two processes rather than trying to make the new process look identical to the old process. One interesting fact here is as the customer shifts from means to outcomes, this actually becomes easier. Because now it's not about, did I replicate your invoice processing steps exactly as you do it today? It becomes more about, did I process your invoice exactly as you wanted it processed so that your business goals got met? As long as you got paid on time, as long as you got paid accurately, you really don't care how I executed that invoice process, right? So that shift from means to outcomes actually facilitates some of this work. Risk, well, this is the one thing that doesn't change. Regulatory compliance actually exists on both sides, but there's some additional metrics you have to look at on regulatory compliance. So, for example, operational risk. So some of you might be aware of Basel II and Basel III, which are banking-related regulations. There are similar ones like Solvency II, which are all focused on operational risk. Well, how do I look at the operational risk of a process that I've shifted to BPaaS? For example, if I can show that the operational risk of a process actually decreased significantly by the shift to BPaaS, a bank may be able to hold back less money in its reserves. If you can have a 1% impact on the amount of money a bank has to hold in reserve, that's a massive impact on the bank's bottom line. So how can we think about these issues? Our privacy, it's no longer about intrusion detection, as we were saying. The privacy aspects of my employee stealing information becomes more important than just the intrusion detection that we have been focusing on earlier. So some of you may be aware of this, but I fundamentally believe a lot more work needs to be done exactly in this domain. A quick pitch, of course, for the company. I always have to do a little bit of that or I'll get into trouble with my investors. We have a bunch of patents in this space, bunch of patents issued. Actually, many of these ones which are saying aloud, actually 2 of them already got granted this week. So we essentially have 7 patents that are now issued in this domain, and we have got several more patents that we're working on. Now, one thing is that no one company can really solve this problem. And what we are looking for is help from the outsourcing ecosystem, help from the cloud computing ecosystem. Let's work together to find ways to make BPaaS truly achieve BPaaS, take some of these limitations of scalability out from the equation. And if we can do that, I think BPaaS is going to be extremely successful. Now that we've discussed BPaaS, let me move on to an associated concept of process flexibility. And we're going to come back to BPaaS at the end. So process flexibility is a very simple concept. In a market which is characterized by rapid changes, if you have process inflexibility, basically you have optimized your process perfectly for the market conditions, for the regulatory conditions that you were expecting, then when market conditions change and regulatory conditions change, it actually becomes very expensive for you to go in and fix it. Now, let's take a specific example of this approach. Let's imagine you're optimizing a process. Well, if you have it optimized down to the absolute perfect level, what you will have done is taken all the variance out of the system. You will have taken away the time for people to innovate. You would have taken away the ability for people to step back and say, hey, is there something different about the process that I should react to? Because they're so focused on getting just their specific activity done at the speed at which they're supposed to do the activity that they can't take the time to say, hey, has the process changed? Hey, what can I do to improve the process? Which is why it's so important to have this capability of process flexibility, where you look at the market changes and you say, I'm going to design my process for flexibility, where, of course, it may be very well optimized for the old market conditions, but I'm going to not try to get to the perfect optimization, but I will retain certain capabilities which allow me to roll with the punches. If the market conditions change, I want to be able to change with that. And that leads to competitive advantage in a market that undergoes rapid changes. Let's take healthcare as a space right now. Companies that have outsourced their business process and have optimized the business process perfectly may be seeing very good financial returns. But what they might find is there's going to be a significant number of change orders that they'll have to write to their outsourcing providers as the healthcare market changes. If, for example, as a result of regulations, your software has to constantly change, your business processes have to be changed, believe you me, in most cases at least, your contracts did not anticipate that. And what's going to happen is you can't go back to your providers and say, I want you to change this process. I want you to invest this much money into this process change, and I'm not going to pay you more. Invariably, you'll have to go through a change order process and put a lot of money down on the table to help the provider change. If, on the other hand, you had signed a contract with a provider which said, you know what, we anticipate quite a few changes. We are not going to try to get you down to the last penny. We are going to leave some money on the table. We are not trying to make the deal as it stands today as financially attractive to us as it can be, but we are going to require you to take the risk of the process flexibility. We want you to make sure that you're going to be changing the process in response to regulatory changes, for example. Well, that's a perfect case of you not having optimized the process perfectly, but allowing that process flexibility to be designed in. Now, as we look at business processes, unfortunately, they're fundamentally inflexible. And they're inflexible for various reasons. If I look at the systems, well, legacy systems may not support proposed changes. Any of you have gone back into an old COBOL software or have had to go into a piece of software that was written 10 years back and nobody knows what it does, but it kind of works? Well, it can be impossible to make any changes. If I look at the process part of it, well, again, every time you change a process, every time you make a significant change to a process, the quality of the process, the productivity of the process immediately drops. And it can easily take months to stabilize the process, to get the quality of the process back to the point where you were before you made the process change. And of course, anybody who has deployed new software in any company knows that operator training, getting user adoption, is a massive limiting factor in any kind of process changes. So unfortunately, process inflexibility is built into the way we do things. But you can have a process flexibility vision, where you basically say, I'm going to design my processes to be flexible. I'm not trying to design it just to run at the lowest cost today or run most efficiently today. I'm also going to take into consideration how am I going to make it flexible. Well, to get flexible systems, what do you need? You need flexible UI. So you're designing your software in such a way that you can change the user interface very quickly if you need to. You need workflow or business process management capabilities. Instead of just hardwiring your data and your process together, having an explicit process layer that can be customized more easily can be a key enabler of flexibility. Flexible data storage, again, rather than imposing certain data structures such that if the data needs change, you can't make changes to the database very easily, that can be extremely inflexible. And we can come back and talk about some of the examples of what we are doing here. But for example, you might have, I remember my quote about how we were able to produce results at GMAC in a short period of time. One of the keys there was the way BeyondCore software works. BeyondCore software doesn't start out with a preconceived set of tables and then say, let me see the client data, and I'm going to shoehorn the client data into the table structures we already have. If we were trying to do that and we had to customize our product for every process, it would take way too long to just understand the client process and customize the solution. You could never have the really rapid turnarounds that BeyondCore delivers. In fact, we have had projects where the whole time from start to finish took less than 2 hours. How do we do that? We designed for flexibility. We said when the data arrives, when I get a first example of an invoice that my client wants me to analyze, let's say they're trying to analyze the invoice data entry process. When that first invoice shows up, I'm going to introspect the invoice, figure out what data structures are necessary, and on the fly create the corresponding data structure. That's a fundamentally different approach to product design than what efficiency calls for. In fact, when I was discussing this design with one of my senior architects, who was one of the senior-most people at Oracle at one time, he was on Oracle's architecture review board, his point was, oh my God, your query is going to run much slower. And it's true. The query, if you're doing a database query in that situation, it's going to run much slower. But the difference is this. Computers are getting faster and faster and faster. And at some point, it's not going to matter that my query runs a little bit slower. What is going to matter, though, is that if I had to customize my solution for a client, it might end up taking 3 months to customize the solution. Instead, my queries are just running 10 times slower, and in 6 months, it's not going to matter. In a year, it won't matter. Any client would rather have your software run a little bit slower than take 6 months to customize it. That's the difference between process flexibility, thinking of it from a flexibility vision, to thinking of it from just efficiency. Now, if you look at rapid process stabilization, again, what we are doing there is saying, rather than doing lift and shift process stabilization, rather than doing traditional approaches to process stabilization, let's find ways to do rapid cycles of focused improvement. So, for example, whenever we analyze a client process, we usually will find some very small parts of the process that are accounting for most of the errors. Well, why do you want to put in your efforts in every part of the process? Why not just focus in on the precise root causes that the technology finds? That kind of a focused approach to improving a process can be extremely, extremely effective. And by the way, I'm trying to not make this too much of a BeyondCore pitch. So those of you who are interested, contact me, and I'll walk you through many, many cases of what we mean by getting really detailed information. It can be down at the level of these 10 operators are confusing debits and credits while processing invoices, and that's costing you $2 million a year, for example. Or this person is processing every invoice as urgent, and that's having a 2 days impact to your cash conversion cycle. These savings can be massive. But again, the focus is less a matter of how much the savings are, but the key point here is when you're designing for process flexibility, when you're making sure your processes can be improved very, very quickly, rather than trying to see, can my process be most efficient that it can be today, it's a fundamentally different way of approaching the problem. And then if you look at training, there are certain capabilities that have been put into the market. Actually, one of the things we are doing with the IOP is coming up with specific tests. It's almost like an SAT test for the outsourcing ecosystem. In fact, the U.S. Department of Labor has endorsed this as part of the government's effort to provide training to unemployed people. There is a way by which the U.S. government is subsidizing these standardized tests in the U.S. today. Why? Because we are trying to find ways to make the training part of it, the hiring part of it, very, very scalable. So you have to start getting, when you look at the training, you have to start getting operator specific. In fact, when we do these analysis, often what happens is the two highest error rate operators will have errors in completely different fields. How does it make sense to give them the exact same training? Of course it doesn't. If you're going to provide training, isn't it more logical to look at what training will have the greatest process impact and then provide just that training? Again, today we don't do that, but shifting to process flexibility says, I will first figure out what impact this will have on my training and then provide the training, making it highly cost-effective, and there are some examples of much faster training that we have been able to enable. Now, what exactly happens when we took BPaaS and we connect process flexibility? Instead of optimizing my systems, my processes, and my people, all of a sudden you can get an optimization of the outcome. Instead of doing just local maxima, you're moving towards global maxima. And that, the concept of process flexibility as added to BPaaS is, we believe, going to be the key catalyst for adoption of BPaaS looking forward. Well, let me switch gears quite a bit and put on my IOP Cloud Computing chapter hat. And in fact, I'm going to quickly see whether there were any questions on this first part before I switch on. Okay, so one is, what does BPaaS stand for? Well, BPaaS is Business Process as a Service, and we're going to go into a little bit more of that. So while this definition of cloud computing only looks at platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and software as a service, what BPaaS does is it's one more layer on top of that. And we're going to look at the Gartner definition in a second and how BPaaS relates to that. That's the only question that I see right now, so I'll go right into the presentation. So a few case studies here. Now, before I go into the case study, let me share with you a framework that the IOP Cloud Computing chapter has developed. Actually, I should step back and tell you really quickly what the IOP is. It's essentially the global standard-setting organization for the outsourcing profession. It has 110,000 members and affiliates worldwide, so it's extremely broad. We're not just talking about any one country here. There are chapters all around the world, in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, in Africa. And the members list, of course, I'm not going to read it, but as you can see, it's a pretty wide swatch of customers and providers of outsourcing. Now, what the IOP Cloud Computing chapter did is it said, look, we need to figure out this cloud computing space, and especially the business process as a service part of it, because that is critical to our view of cloud computing. First, we looked at this space called technology as a service. Interestingly enough, when we look at technology as a service, it really is more of the software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. That is, to a certain extent, getting lumped together as technology as a service. And the mantra for it, the way to think about it is technology as a service is all about standardize my mess and run for less, right? So instead of having an environment where I have multiple different mail servers, perhaps configured a little bit different everywhere, can I go on to a hosted version of mail, okay? The layer on top of that, though, is something we are calling execution as a service. And the idea behind execution as a service is you want to consolidate systems and eliminate borders. So if I look at a step in a business process, let's say I'm doing an invoice data entry, or I'm doing a claims data entry, or I'm doing a claims adjudication. I'm doing a discrete step in a business process. Today I might have a situation where there are 10 different parts of my organization, some of which are using an SAP application, some of them are using an Oracle application, or at the very least they're using different versions of the same application, and it can get extremely complex extremely quickly. And a shift to execution as a service says, I'm going to have one centralized way where I'm going to access this information and process this information. One easy way to think of this is imagine software as a service plus people who are interacting with that software as a service. If you think of it that way, execution as a service is about getting one discrete activity done. One layer on top of that is this idea of coordination as a service. Here what we're trying to do is if I look at a complex business process that spans multiple points in the organization, let's take the claims example again. There's a claims data entry. There's a claims adjudication. There's a payment step. There's a reconciliation step. And if I look at each of those steps, there's a complex flow of information that's happening throughout the organization. Well, how can we seek a global optimum for this process rather than doing local optima at each step? For example, let's say the error is being introduced in the invoice data entry step. Going and having conversations with your tax guy saying, hey, we overpaid overpaid our taxes is not going to help you if the reason they overpaid the taxes was because in the invoice step somebody switched the tax amount and the freight amount. Okay? You have to be looking at global optima because many of these problems are actually created in a different step on the process which affects a later stage. Together, at a fundamental level, these two layers is what's traditionally being called business process as a service in the marketplace today. Our chapter, though, has defined one more layer, which is innovation as a service. The idea here is, if you look at the consumer cloud computing space, one of the most exciting and powerful things that has happened in that space is the concept of the mashup, where I can take different capabilities, layer them on top of each other, and I suddenly have something which is greater than the sum of its parts. Well, the equivalent of that is innovation as a service. The whole idea here is if you can create a marketplace where people can contribute BPaaS solutions that can take information from other BPaaS solutions, do some improvement on it, and layer the information back onto a second or third BPaaS solution, then you can start mashing up these capabilities. You can start layering these capabilities on top of each other, and you will get something which is greater than the sum of its parts. And that is what we're calling innovation as a service, and the mantra here is that the world of ideas always beats your best ideas. What we mean by this is, if you consider the best engineers inside your company, they might come up with some stunning ideas, stunning revolutionary ideas for how to improve your process. But all the people out there, all the various ideas that come up in the world, that's going to be better than whatever your best people can come up with. But today there isn't an easy way. For example, if a team of 3 people sitting in Brazil come up with a really cool algorithm that would be very exciting for Citigroup, there isn't an easy way for them to go to Citigroup and say, I want to use this technology. Would you like to use it? Now imagine a world where Citigroup has a fully secure business process as a service layer where they can be absolutely confident that if somebody else layers their capabilities on top of Citigroup, the regulatory problems are taken care of, the security concerns are taken care of, the privacy concerns are taken care of. Through technological means, they can be much more open to trying out different ideas, trying out layering of different capabilities and seeing, can the technology work? So the opening of the idea economy happens through the innovation as a service layer. How does this match with the Gartner's framework that people have done? This was actually a slide that was shown in the first day of this conference, but let's zoom in on one part of it. If I look at the cloud enablers part that Gartner talks about, the application services, the app infrastructure services, the system infrastructure services, that's what maps to technology as a service. Whereas the information services and the business services layer loosely maps to innovation as a service, coordination as a service, and execution as a service. Well, let's move on to some case studies. The first case study is an execution as a service case study from Genpact, where they had a situation where the client was looking for help with the order-to-cash process. And they essentially wanted to remove the inefficiencies of having multiple legacy systems, allow the customer to do self-service whenever possible, and allow partial fulfillment of the process. Well, the Genpact solution was they created a software, I think this is an existing software as a service solution called Genpact's Electronic Invoice Presentation and Payment Platform. They consolidated all of the billing systems into one system. They enabled customer self-service. They allowed customers to dispute part of a bill and pay the rest. So essentially what you're seeing here is exactly what we defined for execution as a service, multiple fragmented legacy systems consolidated into one. Because they have consolidated it into one web-based system, it's much easier for enabling both end customer self-service and the work that Genpact's people might be able to do on the exact same system. The delivered impact was 20% reduction in invoices and associated cost of processing. Now think of it this way. If you have a 20% reduction in cost of processing and number of invoices, that is going to have a far bigger impact on your cost structure than consolidation of email servers, for example. This is often where the big bucks are going to lie. And using the ability to enable self-service, bringing down the expenses, some of that is, of course, could have been done with software as a service, but what has been done here is not only is the software as a service component there, but also the human-centric business process is also being delivered by Genpact. Before I move off the slide, one thing I must say, and fair warning, Genpact is a firm that BeyondCore does some work with, and I happen to admire the company quite a bit. But if you look at Genpact's announcements in the last couple of weeks, go Google this. And what you're going to see is Genpact just bought a company called Accretive. Genpact did some other announcements around licensing deals, partnership deals. Essentially, this is a company that is very clearly making a bet for business process as a service. Now, why is it that they're doing BPaaS? You should be thinking about why a company the size of Genpact would be making such a big push there. Now, SpeechCycle, this is actually a Microsoft customer, and they do a lot of this work based on Azure. But essentially what they have is a system whereby when a call comes in, a support call comes in, it's an infrastructure that an operator might use to deal with that support call. There are aspects of execution as a service there because when a call comes in, the call is routed to an appropriate operator. The operator is provided certain information that they can interact with immediately. They can interact with a single system instead of having to go to 10 places. Well, that is execution as a service. But there is a far more interesting coordination as a service layer here as well. Because what they can allow you to do is to look at the business process flow and say, okay, under these circumstances, I want access to the SAP system. I want some kind of access to the ERP or CRM system. And then I want the control flow to move back to the call center operator for the operator to get some context-specific information that they can use to address the customer call. So you're shifting away from just giving the operator the ability to interact with one system and deal with a call to a complex business flow which might have certain automated steps and certain manual steps, and there's a coordination going on. In fact, they allow people to go in and change that workflow and modify it and extend it. Well, that's a perfect example of coordination as a service because you're focusing on the business process as it spans multiple systems. The next example is it was a proof of concept project where Microsoft's invoice process is outsourced to Accenture was put on the cloud. Basically, they created a single consistent interface in Azure, and data came from Microsoft to Accenture. Accenture could interact with the system on the cloud, do the data entry, and the data could be sent in to the back-end systems. The data was passed on to BeyondCore as an innovation as a service layer, and BeyondCore analyzed the data. Again, it was passed on through the cloud as XML data. We analyzed the data. We created our XML report, which could then be fed into Office Live. From Office Live, the information went back to Accenture for Accenture to improve the systems, right? So you ended up creating a closed-loop system where BeyondCore as an innovation as a service layer was able to add capabilities to Accenture without disrupting the work Accenture was doing. This whole capability is layered on top. It is not in the middle. It does not affect all the work, all the value creation Accenture is already doing. It just adds on additional capabilities to Accenture for them to serve the client further. By the way, all of these case studies were part of an article that was co-written by Microsoft, Accenture, Genpact, BeyondCore, and Infosys, and it's available on Outsourcing Today magazine. So if you go in there, you can find this article. If you go to our website, you will also find a link to this article. There's a different case study here. This is the Infosys proof of concept. And by the way, part of the reason these are proof of concepts is as we get into the innovation as a service layer, this is still getting defined. I'm showing you cutting edge stuff, but if I would like you to kind of look forward and say 3 years from now, 4 years from now, what does business process as a service look like if we take these proof of concepts and extrapolate out? Today, I haven't found excellent examples of complete BPaaS solutions beyond a few that I'm showing you. But as we look forward 3 to 4 years, I fundamentally believe business process as a service is going to be key. In fact, Gartner is already predicting a massive growth in that domain. And Shaugatak, as you saw, was predicting 50% of BPO would move to BPaaS. Well, BPO is a $250 billion business today, if not more. So 50% shift to BPaaS is an amazing shift in such a massive business. So very similar situation. Well, the policy data from a execution as a service, from a technology as a service solution came over to BeyondCore. BeyondCore analyzed it, identified errors, identified patterns to those errors, down at the specificity of, hey, here are the specific operators who are making specific mistakes in specific fields. That information was fed back out. So, for example, one pattern was that just 3 fields out of 30 counted for 37% of overall errors. Obviously, that's very useful information, and because this was done very, very quickly in an automated way, that information could be fed to Infosys for Infosys to further improve the business process. And now Infosys can take that information, do operator-specific training, change the process, change the UI, and improve the process further, and now you have a closed loop of innovation. Okay, and as many of you might know, anytime you can create a closed innovation loop, you can really speed up how the impact innovation can happen, rather than open loops where the feedback is not going back into the system and cannot be acted on immediately and quickly. Putting it all together, again, this is an image from the exact same article on Globalization Today, and essentially what we were doing here is saying, if I have execution as a service layer creating data entry on the cloud, that data goes into a technology as a service layer where the data is being stored on the cloud. The data is being passed on to innovation as a service layer, which creates actionable insights, very detailed actionable insights. That information would go into a layer where you try to improve the process. And you might improve the process by making process changes. You might do a UI redesign. You might do operator-specific training. And that feeds back into that cycle and does a closed loop. That green part of it, the improving of the process, today is being done manually. Okay? But as we look at the technology space that's happening, there are some very interesting capabilities, some of which we have filed patents on, so I can't talk openly about it. You'll hear about it in about a year's time when the patent is published. But essentially what we are doing, what companies are trying to do here is, can I have this UI redesign happen automatically? Can I look at the user interface behavior, look at the operator error rates, look at which operator makes errors where, and change the UI automatically in some way? Can I have the process changes become more and more automated? Perhaps through the through the patterns that have been observed, could the patterns be fed into a rules engine which now looks for those errors on an ongoing basis? Could the patterns be fed into a BAM BPM capability and change the underlying workflow? So as you start thinking about, can we make the improvement of the process, the improved step, also automated? Every other step here was pretty much automated. And all of a sudden, you can end up with very rapid cycles of flexible innovation. That, I really think, is the true future of BPaaS, where we shift the market from focusing on outcomes instead of focusing on the means, allow the incentives to be fully aligned because the client and the provider are both now focused on delivering the business process as effectively as possible, shift the the providers from thinking about how can I hire more people and how can I manage 10,000 more people to a different thinking about how can I enable this kind of a process platform and allow other people to come in and work on my process platform. In fact, one interesting trend there is efforts by firms like Odesk, which are doing micro outsourcing, Odesk or WeWork or Elance. Many of these firms are doing micro outsourcing. And in the case of Odesk and a few others, they're actually doing this kind of work on an ongoing basis, not just a transactional level. So that shift is already happening. And isn't the market of creating that BPaaS platform, creating that BPaaS marketplace far more financially attractive, far more scalable than the task of let's manage armies of people, let's train armies of people, and let's control armies of people to achieve results for our clients? I think both the incentives alignment and the margin attractiveness of the margin is going to cause more and more of BPO providers to start looking at BPaaS, as also the large platform as a service providers, the large software as a service providers have to be looking at BPaaS and saying, you know what, here's a massive domain, $50 billion today, quite possibly $125 billion or more tomorrow, that is clearly underserved, that does not have technological solutions to scalability. Rather than fighting over yet another candidate over the platform as a service domain or infrastructure as a service domain, why don't we go and become the big guys in BPaaS? So you're going to see the large technology provider companies shift towards BPaaS, as also the large outsourcing firms, and the wild card to some extent are the microsourcing companies like Odesk. It'll be interesting to see where they go. But the future of BPaaS is bright indeed, and I encourage each and every one of you to join us, and let's build real BPaaS rather than marketing balderdash. I think that's the biggest concern that I have about this market today, is that the marketing hype is getting ahead of the market reality, and many of these people are taking very limited definitions of BPaaS and running with it, and if they manage to confuse the market, it's just going to make this whole effort to build true scalable BPaaS almost impossible. So thank you, everyone. I think we have about 8 minutes left on the call, so if you have any questions, please send them to me using chat. Okay. Well, I'm going to keep the chat window open for a little while more, but whenever I don't get any questions, I'm always in two minds. Did I do such a good job that there were no questions, or did I confuse everyone so much that there are no questions? Hopefully it's the former and not the latter. Couple of things I would suggest you do. If you have any questions or comments on this, please do email me. There's also the Stanford team of Stanford students who are basically interviewing various companies trying to get a sense of what exactly does BPaaS stand for, what does it mean, what is the potential future of BPaaS, how can we hyperscale BPaaS, and these questions are extremely interesting. So if any of you, they're primarily trying to interview large customers of outsourcing and cloud computing, large technology providers of cloud computing, and large outsourcing providers that are trying to move towards a BPaaS strategy. So if you're interested in speaking with them, please send an email to me as well, and I'll route it to the students at Stanford. Given that there are no other questions, I guess we'll end the conference 5 minutes early. Thank you very much for attending the Cloud Slam conference, and I believe this was the last keynote of the conference, and hope all of you have enjoyed the conference as much as I did. Thank you.